This section is going to be dealing with a continuation almost directly from the last section we were talking about, which is the rule of the Federalists in the United States, where you have presidents like George Washington and then his successor John Adams, and you also have a succession of members of Congress who generally sided with the Federalists. Sort of stronger central government, more loose interpretation of the Constitution. All these people are going to get replaced by the election of 1800 and then on into early 1801. We're going to see that the election of 1800 is one of the bigger political moments in American history. We're going to see a shift also then governmentally to the Democrat-Republicans under Thomas Jefferson. The effects that they create, that they're going to move off in a somewhat different direction, a much stricter interpretation of the Constitution. We're also going to see some important social changes that are going to take place here in Jeffersonian America as well, through most of the first decade of the 19th century in this as well. And so we're going to have some governmental changes, as we'll see with the introduction of judicial review, the acquisition of the Louisiana Territory, essentially doubling the size of the United States. But we're also going to talk about a lot of other problems that are going to take place, because Jefferson up until this point has been kind of a theorist. He had been governor of Virginia before, he had been the Secretary of State, but basically he'd been kind of a political theorist. He writes the Declaration of Independence, and he argues about his ideas of government, but he finally in 1800 is going to win the presidency, and then we're going to see what happens when you go from theory to reality. And it doesn't always work out exactly as you think it is going to. So this is going to be our topic for this. So when the election of 1800 rolls around, the Federalist Party generally were sort of popularly portrayed, especially by their political rivals, as kind of wealthy aristocrats. In some cases, they pointed out the ideas that, well, these guys, they really favor England, and they're the remnants of the English monarchy, which, of course, as we can see, even at the earliest days of the Republic, people are given over to political hyperbole. That is not a recent invention of our political discourse, and goes back to really the earliest days of political activity in the United States. The reality was, though, that the Federalists had power, at least in terms of the executive branch, for 12 years. They were the ones that were kind of the main architects behind the U.S. Constitution, and they were the first governments that were put into place to execute and create the new government under the new U.S. Constitution. But in reality, if you were to look at just straight up Democratic majorities, the Federalists probably never really had a popular majority. There were probably more people that were still sort of hearkening back to kind of 17th century, Whiggish, small government, leave me alone, kind of government. But the way that the electoral system had sort of worked itself out with property requirements and then media control and a number of other both social and governmental factors, the Federalists had managed to win. They managed to win power 3 presidential terms in a row, and then also a succession of essentially Congresses. And really, though, the first election that kind of comes to a head is going to be the 1796 election. Adams probably only wins that one because of Washington's endorsement, which sways some of the electors, and then also some restrictions on voting, which, of course, are going to hit Jefferson's voters the hardest. Well, what a difference 4 years makes, because by 1800s, Jefferson's base, the farmers, really had made enough strides in terms of gaining the franchise to ensure his election. Adams, while doing a lot of things that you and I might regard as, well, he's pretty far-sighted, he's a pretty good idea of what he was trying to do, avoid war with France, avoid these problems here overseas. While they had been good ideas, they weren't necessarily very popular ones. And Adams' political opponents are basically able to tar him with the same brush as the rest of the Federalist Party, that he was this sort of wealthy, out-of-touch aristocrat from the North and the East, and the rest of the country is moving south and moving west. So the Democrat-Republicans of Thomas Jefferson, not only are they going to put their guy, Jefferson, in the White House, but they're also going to sweep the congressional elections. And that's going to give them dominance in 2 of the 3 branches of the federal government. So here you can see, if you compare this, if you want to click back to some of the earlier slides of the election of 1796, you can see that there's been a pretty significant shift in terms of the electoral vote. Again, we don't have returns of the popular returns from the election of 1800. But we are going to see that Jefferson is going to move ahead in a much more convincing fashion than just a sort of two-vote majority, two electoral vote majority as he had 4 years earlier. Adams had 4 years earlier. Jefferson now is going to move ahead 73 to 65, capture a much larger percentage of the vote. And you can see again the geographic distribution. The North, the East is going to favor still the Federalists. The South and the growing West is going to be favoring ever increasingly Thomas Jefferson and his group. But this represents a pretty significant shift for a lot of reasons. Not the least of which is what this proved really to the rest of the world. George Washington was elected the first sort of popularly elected leader in world history. You had never really had basically the people of the nation getting together and say, okay, who do we want our leader to be? Well, we want this guy. Well, you have a lot of people around the world who are looking at the only operating democratic republic on earth in the United States of America, and they're all sort of just kind of looking down their noses, just waiting for the United States to kind of trip over its own skates and wind up in the ditch. Because they all have governments that essentially are completely antithetical. The idea that sort of people can govern themselves, no, that's not how things work. And of course, it's particularly worrisome to some of these other autocratic governments that the idea that people can rule themselves would spread and thus kick people like crowned heads out of power. So they're kind of looking at this and they say, well, yeah, George Washington, yeah, he wins, and it's pretty peaceful, assumption of power, but he's George Washington. That's really not much of an achievement for a democratic people to elect the most popular, the most well-respected, the greatest leader that they have in their country, to elect him their leader. That's really not that big of a deal. Just wait. If you read in a lot of the primary source material, a lot of these political theorists in these other countries saying, you just wait, because once you have one political party in power, they're not just going to cough up power to another group because they lose an election. These guys have control over the military, and they're going to use it. They're going to use it to stay in power. You just wait. You just watch, because nobody gives up power peacefully. That's not how you do things, right? But what we're going to see here is the election of 1800 is sometimes referred to as historians as the Revolution of 1800, because for the first time in world history, one faction, the Federalists, they had been in power. They peacefully allowed another group, Jefferson's Democrat Republicans, to assume power. The glue that held all this together was the democratic process. The Federalists assumed, well, okay, we lost. We lost the election of 1800, but there's no reason to think that in the next election cycle we can't come back. And this was something that the Federalist Papers had spoken to, was that if you have elections that are fairly close together, every 2 years for the House of Representatives, every 4 years for President of the United States, no more than 6 years for a single senator to sit into office, that this will keep people to not want to use violence, because they'll say, okay, yeah, we lost, but we only have to wait a couple of years or a few years in order to have another chance at electing peacefully somebody to replace whatever political person that they don't like in power. So there had been some peaceful transitions before in world history, but always with the threat of force. So, for example, the Glorious Revolution in England, where there's not a lot of fighting, there's not a lot of bloodshed, but the king doesn't abdicate the throne just because, well, people have chosen somebody else, I will gracefully bow. That kind of thing doesn't happen. This was the first time in world history where that had taken place. You got one group's like, we lost. Here, you guys are in control. All right. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not some sore losering or some sore winnering sort of going on, because these people are human. And that kind of thing is to be expected. So a lot of these Federalists who are losing the political cover, especially Federalists that had been put into office by the Washington or the Adams administration, many of these guys feared retribution, that the Democrat Republicans that they had sort of lambasted, in these election campaigns. At one point, Adams's people were distributing pamphlets that, if Thomas Jefferson is elected president, you will hang. So, the next time you hear nasty grams on TV about politicians, and you say, oh, this is so mean-spirited, yeah, trust me, it could be worse. So they're naturally fearing a lot of retribution from Jefferson's administration, that he may fire them, he may send the army after them, and so they're worried that just because they kind of vacate the office relatively without qualms, that doesn't mean that Jefferson and his people are going to come in and not sort of put the screws to them. Jefferson, for his part, showed moderation. And he says, no, we need not come in and go after these people. He didn't attack Federalists. He left most of them in their old jobs. He said, as long as you guys, perform your duties, don't worry about retribution on my part. Jefferson's main change to the presidency was more of a social one. He tended to dress poorer. He held less formal occasions at the White House. He got rid of the idea that sort of at least for a while, the president kind of sits at the head of the table and that all these people sort of arranged by rank around him. He got rid of that. He didn't give a lot of public speeches as president of the United States. And so he held more to his idea of equality, of egalitarianism, and this really began to kind of spread out through a lot of the social population of the United States. This idea of egalitarianism, the breakdown of lines of deference between different types of people. And this is something that had been constantly going on in America, basically since the founding of colonies. But this was something that Jefferson really accelerated. And so it's easy to sort of just say this, that, well, Jefferson had some social changes that he put on in the United States. But really, when you think about society and how it's beginning to reshape itself here at the dawn of the 19th century, these are some pretty important changes. Jefferson is also the first president to use Washington as his capital. A lot of the buildings, the executive mansion was still under construction, but he was able to use Washington City as his capital. The previous administrations had had to kind of bounce between New York City and Philadelphia as temporary capitals until Washington was ready to use as the capital of the United States. So, President Jefferson, he is no longer a theorist. He is no longer the guy who's saying, well, this is how things ought to run. He is now the guy that can actually shape policy in terms of what the United States is going to do. When he says that this is how the Constitution should be interpreted, he's going to have a lot of sway in getting that to take place because, of course, it is his party that now runs the show in Congress. So he is able to turn around and say, hey, this is really what I want to see happen. They're probably going to give him what he wants for political reasons. So Jefferson, he is informal, he is unassuming. I've seen some people recently write that Jefferson actually had a sort of a mild form of Asperger's disease, and he had some sort of social dissonance, different little problems. I don't know if that's true or not, but sort of why not? He was informal, he was unassuming with a lot of people, and he does away with a lot, not necessarily all, but a lot of the Federalist policy left over from the Adams/Washington years. Now, one of the problems, of course, that he ran into was the fact that while he disagreed with a lot of what the Federalists were doing in terms of military policy, foreign policy, their construction of the Constitution, he couldn't deny the fact that Alexander Hamilton, the Federalist, he couldn't deny that Hamilton's economic reforms had worked. The United States, when it was coming into the constitutional period, had a mountain of debt. It was financially insolvent. It had trouble getting even short-term loans at foreign banks. And so he complained. He complained, though, throughout this period that everything that Hamilton was doing was unconstitutional. By the time he's president, he realizes that Hamilton's economic reforms had worked. And so he decides he's going to keep these. He's going to keep these economic platforms, even the Bank of the United States. Even the Bank of the United States, which was the main bone of contention between he and Hamilton, and probably the main reason that Jefferson leaves Washington's cabinet is, hey, look, there's nothing in the Constitution that says you can have a Bank of the United States. We've got one. I can't, if you're not going to listen to anything that I say, I'm going to leave. All right. The only major change economically that Jefferson decided to make was to get rid of the excise tax, the whiskey tax. And we talked about that before, that this was a tax to bring in a lot of these Western farmers whose main trade was in the untaxed trade of whiskey. And so this, of course, was something that Jefferson had protested against. He says, this unfairly hits, farmers, and farmers are my people, and this is unfair. So he's going to get rid of this excise tax. Well, hopefully you're sitting down at the computer or wherever it is you're watching, because this was a point at which the government actually cared whether or not it spent more money than it took in. I know that that's hard to understand, but this was the way things went. So with the repeal of the excise tax, that meant that there was a certain amount of revenue that was no longer going to be coming into the federal government. And so Jefferson, who's worried about running a deficit, says, okay, we've got to replace that somewhere. All right? And this is a great little thinking exercise, a little critical thinking skill. A lot of times you'll see these politicians, whenever they talk about, balancing the budget or spending, we've got, spending's way up here and taxes, revenues don't keep up with that. We need more tax money. We need more tax. We need more revenue. There's another side of that equation, and that is, well, if you didn't spend so much dadgum money, you wouldn't need high taxation in order to make up for that. So this is the route that Jefferson decided to do. Instead of sort of raising revenue somewhere else to meet the expenditures of the government, if he's going to reduce taxation and reduce revenue, well, you just reduce spending to go down with it as well. And generally speaking, this fit a lot of Jefferson's proclivities in that he decided to cut the defense budget. He decided to cut the Army and Navy, and he cut them to the bone. To Jefferson, all right, bringing the budget down just across the board was the way the federal government was supposed to go, because the less money that it spent, the less important it was. The federal government wasn't supposed to be all that important anyway, so this makes sense on that level. And in terms of the military, Thomas Jefferson was of the opinion, really, that, well, military is kind of bad, right? Free citizens ought to, by themselves, just like fought the Revolution, just form these militia units and fight these guys off. And what do soldiers do? Well, they're just going to hassle us, just like the British soldiers did. He once stated that a standing army was a great threat to any free citizenry anywhere. So he had a great deal of disdain for the military in terms of its relationship to its home population. But also he generally had the idea too that, well, if you don't have a military, you won't get into wars with other people because you won't have a military to fight it. Not really the best sort of idea, at least in terms of effectiveness. So what you're going to see is he did understand the idea that the United States did have a very long coastline that had to be defended. So what do we do for that? We don't want to have a giant sort of navy that's going to go over and get us involved in sort of trade wars with other people. So he got with these military planners and says, what's the cheapest, kind of naval vessel we can get? It's like, well, there's a little two-masted, little mortar boat kind of things. It's this, it's got this mortar in kind of the middle of it, and it shoots this shell high up in the air, and then it comes down and lands on the decks of these ships. It's actually a pretty accurate type of weapon, and of course it hits the deck of the ship rather than the really thick oak planking on the side of the hull, so it does a lot of damage, but it has a relatively short range. So, okay, Jefferson said, okay, we'll just buy a whole bunch of these, and when an enemy approaches our coastline, we'll just send these guys out, we'll just mortar the hell out of them. Okay, fine, right? That's the direction they decided to go to save money. Of course, anybody who knew anything about how wars are actually fought realized that this mosquito fleet, as the opponents have called it, was laughably useless for real coastal defense. Because an enemy is going to have a very large and powerful navy with these sort of long 9 and 12 and 32-pound cannons that can hit you, a mile away, and all they're going to do is they're going to sit like a mile away from you, and they're just going to blow you out of the water. And that's exactly what would later happen in the War of 1812, when the British Navy is going to attack the United States' coastline. In fact, during a storm, one of these mosquitoes, a big, probably hurricane-like environment, one of these is picked up out of its moorings and is sort of washed a mile inland in the flood surge and is deposited in the middle of a farmer's cornfield. And the Federalists sort of joked about Jefferson's mosquito fleet that this particular cornfield is now safe from any enemy attack. So this is the direction that Jefferson decided to go. When you look at, though, the other side of this, Jefferson did have sort of a big kind of spine moment in that he took on a bunch of North African pirates in a trade war. Essentially what's going on here is, as the war in Europe between England and France and a number of other European powers is getting more and more heated, you have a number of these North African kind of basically city-states that are engaging in piracy. And the way that it worked was they would charge protection money to European powers, to powers of the United States, and you paid them, and then they told their sailors, their pirates, don't attack these ships. And they would then get the money. And so this was kind of how this worked. You sort of paid off the bad guys, and they would leave you alone. And basically everybody did this, and this was the United States' plan as well. Well, several of these especially the Day of Tripoli, went after the United States. Some diplomatic problems took place. They grabbed some United States citizens. They upped the ante. And then this was something that finally Jefferson decided, okay, we're not going to put up with this anymore. And he sent in the Navy and the United States Marines to attack Tripoli. And in some sort of pretty heroic kind of stuff, you have the U.S. Navy sort of bombarding Tripoli from the outside. They're trying to work their way into the protected harbor, and then you get the U.S. Marines sort of landing on the landward side, attacking and cutting off the city from the landward side. Anyway, long story short, the United States is going to succeed in this, and they are going to reduce the U.S. cost for overseas shipping. And it's actually going to prove a pretty important point to some of these North African pirates that the United States is not some pushover kind of power, and that you need to have a little more respect for the good old United States of A, right? This became such a popular thing that apparently got turned into a musical. Here's The Siege of Tripoli, right? A pianoforte composed by B. Carr. I have no idea who B. Carr is, but I found this and thought it was pretty interesting. So this was a war they decided to set to music. So it's a historical naval sonata for the pianoforte, right? Here's an artist's rendition of several of the outlying towns around southeast of Tripoli being cleared out by a charge of the United States Marines. So this is some of the earliest activities. For those of you who are fans of the United States Marine, and you know the Marine Corps hymn, you know, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, right? They kind of recount some of the major efforts of the Marines in the 1800s. We'll talk about halls of Montezuma later when we get to the Marines in the war with Mexico. So Jefferson really gets his sway. Obviously, he doesn't have to ask anybody's opinion in terms of what he wants the president to do, because he is the president. And probably Congress is going to give him pretty much whatever he wants, because they're his political people in that as well. But one of the problems he's going to run into here is the federal court system. Because when Jefferson assumes office, there had been 12 years of Federalist presidents. And the judges serve lifetime terms on the bench. So what that means is, first, Washington for 8 years, and then Adams for 4 years have been putting in Federalists. They've been putting in Federalists into the federal appeals, circuit, and Supreme Courts of the United States government. And so when Jefferson assumes office, he basically has got this all Federalist judiciary of the United States. So that doesn't change just because, Jefferson got elected, so we're all going to resign. We're all going to quit and let him appoint his own judges. No, that's not going to happen. Now, like I said, the Federalists don't go away totally without a whimper, because we're going to see that once the election returns are in and it's clear that the Federalists have lost, one of the things that they do decide to spend a lot of time on is signing up as many Federalist judges as they can, and Adams even used the last few days, right up until the time that he was no longer president of the United States, signing these commissions for Federalist judges, because he's trying to pack in as many Federalists as possible into the one area of the government that Jefferson, even if he wanted to, couldn't get rid of them. All right? Well, the Democrat Republicans, very understandably, they complain of foul play after Jefferson's term begins. They say, yeah, it's coming, you can't play dirty pool. And yeah, maybe they are, right? I'll leave that up to your own moral sensibilities to determine whether or not they're wrong in doing so. But that was something that they had done. And in fact, it was so, kind of crammed in kind of last minute that there were several of these commissions that were on now President Jefferson's desk. And of course, he says, I'm not going to deliver these. I'm not going to deliver these and make more Federalist judges. The way that this worked was, at this point, you had to nominated to the federal court by the President of the United States. At that point, it had been Adams. Then you would have been confirmed by the Senate, which would have been, for the most part, Federalists. And then, of course, you had a commission that had to be written out by the President of the United States and then delivered to you. And so that was, legally speaking, that was how you got your seat on the bench, was you had to have the commission delivered. So steps 1 and 2 had been completed. Step 3, not completely. There were several of these commissions that were still sitting on the desk when Jefferson assumes office, and he says, no, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to deliver these commissions and make more Federalist judges. Well, one of these would-be judges was a guy named William Marbury. And Marbury says, hey, look, constitutionally, this is all this is all cool because I was nominated, I was confirmed, and the then President of the United States, when it was signed, Adams was still president, and so my commission is legal. You should have to deliver it. And so Marbury sued on that ground that the agent, Mr. Madison, who was acting under Jefferson's order anyway, he had to deliver this, okay? Anyway, the case goes through the labyrinthine legal processes that it has to go to, and eventually it arrives at the Supreme Court. At this point, it arrives on the desk of Chief Justice John Marshall, who is, big surprise, a Federalist. Now, Marshall, you would think, well, this is an open shut kind of case, right? I mean, Marshall's a Federalist, Jefferson's, a not. So John Marshall just, should issue he should get the court, which they're all Federalists, they're probably going to do what he says. Get the court to, hey, tell Jefferson, you got to deliver this commission. We need another Federalist judge. Marbury, his case is totally legitimate, and he's got to be, put on the bench. The reason that, of course, they're not going to do this is he's going to go and he's going to tell the President of the United States, all right, you got to go and deliver this commission. What is the court going to do if the President of the United States says, nah, I don't think so? See, the Supreme Court commands exactly one army fewer than the President of the United States, which is to say they have 0 and he has 1. So that's not going to work out too well if you want to maintain the power of the federal judiciary, which is something that John Marshall, as a Federalist, he wants to do. He doesn't want to give up a lot of power for the federal government. He thinks that the federal government ought to have some power and authority to make sure that these matters are handled in a way that he agrees with. So, how do we snatch victory from the jaws of defeat? Because if we say, hey, Jefferson, go do this, and then he doesn't, well, not only do you not get the result that you want, which is Marbury on the bench as a Federalist, but then you also have a slap to the face of the Supreme Court. So, he issues a decision that says the commission does not need to be delivered. Well, if you're President Jefferson, hey, this works out pretty well for me. However, he says the reason that it does not need to be delivered is because the law that created this commission system, the Judiciary Act that Congress had passed, was unconstitutional because it gave legislative authority to the President of the United States in terms of the commission and some other stuff, the legal technical stuff, okay? In so doing, basically he states that it is the Supreme Court that will decide the constitutionality of laws that Congress passes. This creates what we refer to as judicial review. This is, of course, a power that basically John Marshall ascribes to the court. Nowhere in the Constitution, when you look in the Constitution and the articles that deal with the judiciary, nowhere in it does it say, and the Supreme Court shall determine whether laws passed by Congress are constitutional or not. It doesn't say anything like that anywhere. This is a power that John Marshall, and it may be logical to say that that's the way it ought to work, but there is nothing in the Constitution that says that this is how it works. And in fact, there are a lot of political theories at this prior to Marbury versus Madison, stating that, well, no, I don't think that that is how it should work. In fact, Jefferson, if you remember back when we talked about the Alien and Sedition Act, Jefferson's position was that the states would then be the check against unconstitutionality of laws passed by Congress, because he wanted to give power to the states government. And so there's nothing that he can do. There's nothing that Jefferson can do about this decision. He can go out and sort of tell people, no, the Supreme Court doesn't have this power, but there's no means by which he can sort of get at it. Had the court told him, yeah, you got to deliver this commission, hey, you got to do your job as president, even if the previous president is somebody you didn't agree with, there was something Jefferson could do about that. He could just not do it. He could disagree with it, right? There was an action that he could take, or in this case, not take. But there's nothing that he can do and say, oh, yeah, no, the states have this, whatever, right? So this is an important factor in terms of the overall scope of American history, because now this is something that we do all the time. And every year, usually at the early part of summer, we get a number of Supreme Court decisions that determine whether or not these laws are constitutional, how do federal laws apply in the highest cases, that kind of thing. So We also need to understand Jefferson's relationship to the rest of the world. And one of the biggest and sort of most important of these is the United States' relationship to England and France. All right? In 1800, Spain, which had control of Louisiana, decided to cede Louisiana back to France in 1800 for reasons that are of absolutely no importance to us right now. This was one of the major sticking points of the sort of the Washington administration, because Spain was afraid of more and more Americans showing up in Louisiana. So they had closed trade, and then eventually they got the trade reopened. And so this was a bigger problem now because France is much more actively involved in fighting here in these wars against England and against these other European powers. And so this is a big worrying point for the Jefferson administration as it comes in 1801, because they're worried that Americans are going to get drawn into fighting here on one side or the other of these wars in Europe. And so as more and more Americans, of course, are using New Orleans as a trading depot, using the Mississippi River as a viaduct for their goods, well, this is a serious problem. This is a serious, serious problem for the United States diplomatically around the world. So what basically Jefferson did was he made a proposal that he sent negotiators to France with money and with the authority to draw up a treaty, to meet with the French government and basically say, listen, we'll buy New Orleans. We will buy New Orleans from you guys. You guys sell us this, and then it won't be a big deal. We won't have to worry about getting engaged in your wars, and you'll be able to make some money, okay? Now, by this point, Napoleon Bonaparte has assumed basically total power here in the French government. He's not the emperor yet, but he would be within just a few years after this. But he's really locked down not only military power, but also now political authority as well. And so the counteroffer from Napoleon is not, hey, give me more money from New Orleans. It was, hey, instead of just New Orleans, why don't you guys buy all of Louisiana from me? Now, you've got to remember, when you look at a map today and say, oh, Louisiana, okay, yeah, it's that little, you put it with Arkansas, it looks like a boot, right? No, Louisiana at this point was basically the Mississippi River west almost all the way to the Rockies. It was this huge amount of territory, minus Texas, that was this sort of giant, imposing sort of landmass that France had claimed. Now, really the only thing that was in it, though, was that had been settled was New Orleans. But of course, New Orleans sat right astride the Mississippi River and was incredibly important for that reason. So these negotiators for the United States just can't believe their luck. And they're like, wait a minute, you're going to sell us all this stuff? And yeah, well, what kind of deal are we going to get? Yeah, cents on the acre. I mean, it was just, really, it was going to be a lot of money overall. But hey, you got a chance to really add to the United States. Basically, when you look at it, what the size of the United States at that point to what the size of the United States would be after Louisiana purchase, it would basically double in size. So this is a big deal. So when these guys get back to the United States, hey, we got this treaty proposal worked up, so now we got to get it passed through Congress. We got to get the Senate to confirm it, and of course Jefferson is stunned. This is going to be a much bigger expenditure of money. Obviously a good deal, but still a much larger expenditure of money. And the problem, of course, is Jefferson could find nothing in the Constitution that allowed the government to buy land and add it to the United States. And this really apparently gave him some fits because, of course, he had been a big stickler for, well, the government shouldn't use powers that's not specifically delegated to it in the Constitution. And so, I don't know about this. Of course, he probably wasn't going to have a problem, I think, fudging a little bit for buying the city of New Orleans. But now you've got this giant sort of territory. And he really kind of hemmed and hawed about this. And so finally he says, no, this is going to be a great opportunity for us to expand the cradle of democracy, the sort of the giant Mississippi Valley with all this territory that potentially farmers, which are his people, can move into. So he decided, okay, all right, I've decided, we'll go for it. All right, you guys, I'm going to submit the treaty to the Senate. Now, of course, the Democrat Republicans in the Senate, they didn't have any problem. Yeah, expand the United States. They jumped right on board. They didn't have nearly the same sort of constitutional qualms about this treaty that Jefferson did. So it is going to go in. So this is the size of Louisiana Purchase that's going to go through here in 1803. to give you an idea of kind of how ridiculously huge this territory is. East of the Mississippi, minus Florida, this is the United States up until this point, and then bam, you get all this added with the Louisiana Purchase. So it is a major, major deal here as well. What's out there? I don't know, right? So what you're going to see here is Jefferson is going to send two explorers, Army guy, Lewis and Clark, in to explore this territory. And also you're still seeing some sort of ideas, well, isn't there maybe a water route to the Pacific? And this of course harkens all the way back to Columbus, right? Columbus is trying to sail westward to reach Asia. And you still have some of these guys, well, if there's a way to sail west around to get, not have to sail all the way around South America to get to the Asian trade routes. Anyway, so these guys are going to explore the area. What actually is out there? Is it good for living? Make contact with the American Indians that are out there, all this kind of thing. And so these guys, they set out from St. Louis. They're going to go up the Missouri River, and they go kind of everywhere within the scope of their travels. They explore trails. They meet a number of Indian tribes, they take biological samples, they do sketches, they write down information on the plants and the animals, and they make it all the way to the Pacific in what is now Oregon. The Fort Clatsop, I think, is where they wind up. And eventually they return on a couple of separate routes to explore as many places as passes through the Rocky Mountains as possible. All of this in a 2.5-year journey. Now, if you're interested in this kind of thing, Lewis and Clark's actual adventure is pretty fun to read about, or maybe watch a movie about. I don't know, whatever you're into. There's a lot of sort of personal heroism, interesting sort of encounters between people of different colors. It's great. The reason that we're interested in it, though, is not because of sort of the mind-numbing heroism that involves into sort of embarking into what is for these people sort of an unexplored wilderness, but in fact the social effects that the report that Lewis and Clark made for the rest of the nation. When they get back, they don't say, hey, it's a great big desert, stay away from it, giant or death is there. They say, no, it's a vast open land, should be good for agriculture. It looks like it's just going to be plentiful with life. And so the motivation here is for a lot of Americans is to move west. And this is going to spur continued westward advancement into this zone. And Lewis and Clark is very valuable for that. Now, one of the things that you'll always see whenever you look at Lewis and Clark artist renditions is they're always pointing. Pointing here, Sacagawea, she's pointing there, and Sacagawea is pointing that way. The Indian guide is pointing this way. I have no idea what they're pointing at. Maybe, out in the wilderness, I don't know, the Hardys ought to be over the next hill. I have no idea. But anyway, they're always pointing at something. And there is a great deal of sort of heroism that takes place. There's a lot of mythology, a lot of apocrypha that takes place. Sacagawea, the female, the lady, American Indian, that accompanies them through a large part of their journey, serves as a translator. Supposedly one of the stories is that tribe of Indians were going to attack Lewis and Clark because they thought they were enemies, and Sacagawea said, no, don't do it. And it turns out that the war chief, is Sacagawea's long-lost brother. I don't know if that's true, but, I'm a romantic, so why not, right? Supposedly one of the other stories is one of the porters that had gone along with Lewis and Clark was African-American, and of course the Indians had never seen a guy with black skin before, and so they grab him and they haul him down to the river and they try to wash his skin off, and of course Lewis and Clark, hey, stop! That's what he's supposed to look like. So you have some interesting little vignettes that take place here. When you look at the overall map, though, where these guys sort of start out from St. Louis, and they go all the way up through here, and they head out here to Oregon, and then eventually they work their way back down to St. Louis, and then of course all the way back to Washington to report to President Jefferson. It's a pretty big deal. But a lot of these things that are going on out west, not all of them are positive, because America's expansion is going apace regardless. More and more Americans are moving into this zone between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. And as they get further and further out, you get kind of that wilderness, kind of frontier, sort of Wild West mentality. Most of the time when you go and you see sort of the Wild West movies, it's mostly sort of west of the Mississippi River that you'll see set in kind of the late 1800s. But in the early 1800s, the late 1700s, early 1800s, you've got a lot of lawlessness that's taking place in what was then the Wild West, which was this area in and around the Mississippi River, because you don't have a lot of civilization that has kind of reached that far yet. And a good example of this is the Burr conspiracy, right? Aaron Burr, who is a pretty wildly interesting character. He had been a former vice president of Jefferson and had almost accidentally gotten elected president because you had a tie in the electoral votes. He was really kind of just a political scoundrel, really. When you see the disagreements between different states at this point, you see some of them trying to have a more pro-England sort of trade policy, like New York and New England. Burr had been very active in trying to get New York and the New England states to secede from the United States. And, of course, Burr had probably very humbly offered his services as chief executive. I will be president of the new New England Confederacy, or whatever he was going to call it, right? Well, Alexander Hamilton and some other people, they exposed this plot. And, of course, Burr takes this as a political affront, and Burr challenges Alexander Hamilton to a duel. This is how honorable men settle their differences, despite the fact that, of course, in New York, dueling was actually not legal anymore. But for those of you who don't really understand kind of how honor worked here in the 1800s, it seems kind of silly to do this. And a lot of people, even at that point, realized, okay, this is kind of silly. Public honor demands that you go out when someone insults you and says you're a liar or you're a scoundrel, and they refuse to take it back. Well, I demand satisfaction, right? And you slap them with a glove or challenge them to a duel, or I don't know how it is you're going to do it. And then, of course, there's actually a whole host of procedures that take place. You nominate seconds because the seconds can get together and arrange the details because the two men have threatened to kill each other, and so they can't get together and have a calm meeting about where they're going to meet, what weapons they're going to use, what are the procedures, that kind of thing. So the seconds handle this. All right. Now, most of the time, just like people today, you say a lot of things when you're really, really angry that you don't necessarily mean. People back then weren't terribly different than people now. So, you've insulted my wife, or you've insulted my honor, and so I'm going to kill you. Well, I'm going to kill you right back, right? And so they get mad and they sort of shout at each other. And then they realize, maybe like a week later, do I really want to murder that guy? No. But you have to save face in public, because if you then back down, then it makes you look weak. And so anyway, there are a lot of sort of attachments, social attachments that go along with this. And so a lot of times what would happen here is sometimes the seconds would sort of get together and they would put blank cartridges in the guns, and so turn and fire. They both fire, and of course both guys, they missed. Well, you were both willing to go through with it. Honor has been satisfied, and nobody has to die. Sometimes that would take place, right? In this case, what you have is we're going to actually shoot at each other. At least have live ammunition, right? Well, a lot of these duels, these guys would get to the sort of the field of honor, and they decided, I don't really want to kill anybody. And what they would do is they would sort of aim off, instead of aiming right at the guy, they'd aim a little bit off, and they'd pull the trigger, and then, nobody had to die. And there are very conflicting reports about the duel between Burr and Hamilton. But we look at this because, like I said, it gives you kind of an interesting analogy of where sort of society is, what honor is. We're going to talk about this, especially later when we talk about the American honor system in the South. It is important for this. Supposedly, one of the accounts where Alexander Hamilton sort of fired his gun off. Okay, Burr, we've said some things, right? I'll shoot off, and then we don't have to kill each other. Pow. No big deal. Of course, Burr's like, bam, I'm gonna kill you, you're gonna die, right? And so, he puts one right through Alexander Hamilton's liver, apparently. But like I said, dueling was illegal, and so now Burr is a murderer, and he flees now into the western part of the United States. It then gets wrapped up with some army people and some other sort of ne'er-do-wells to try to get the western parts of these territories to secede, and of course probably Burr thought he was going to be president of like western United States, I don't know what you're going to call it. Anyway, he's caught and he's arrested, okay? And he's put on trial. But the problem with this is the Constitution says that treason is illegal. You cannot commit treason. This is one of the crimes that you can get, nabbed for, all right? But it says nothing about attempted treason, because they hadn't actually gone through with it. And of course, everybody else who had been in the conspiracy, they're all backpedaling, they're all backing out and saying, oh no, I didn't know we were going to be seceding. Oh yeah, Burr, yeah, oh, we were going to help him out, military control, and that sounded like good. Oh no, we weren't going to form our own country. And so nothing actually happened. There's no secession that actually took place. So he is acquitted. He's let go, right? He then moved to Europe, and according to at least one account that I read, he fathered something like 75 illegitimate children. I don't know if that's true or not, but I like to think so, because that really just kind of fits Aaron Burr's personality. So, like I said, this is the situation in this, you know, you got Alexander Hamilton, you got Aaron Burr, you know, I have no wish to kill you, sir. Bam! Shut up, fool! I'm killing people here. So anyway, long story short, Burr lives, Hamilton dies, and that's really all that there is to it, right? Couple of events overseas that are going to affect the United States here take place here in 1805, and that is going to be two major battles that are fought here in these Napoleonic wars, and one is on land and one is at sea. Napoleon is going to fight in a huge battle of Austerlitz, and basically he is going to monkey stomp the Austrian army and the Russian army. And for a long, long time, nobody is going to want to go against Napoleon because he's like dynamite, okay? He's just an incredibly dangerous guy. Even when you outnumber him, he still beats the crap out of you. So Napoleon on land in Europe is basically able to dictate terms to a whole lot of people. You guys do what I say. That same year, you're going to see a major battle that's going to take place in the Atlantic between England and France, and then France's ally Spain. And the problem, of course, with France fighting England is it can't just march its army to England like it can. It can march into Austria, it can march into Prussia, it can march into later Russia, and its army can attempt to conquer. Well, you know, unless you sort of grow, webbed toes and gills or something like that, you're not going to swim your army to England. So you've got to knock England's navy out of the way and land an amphibious army on the shores of England. And so in 1805, you're going to see major Franco-Spanish fleet is going to be off the coast of Spain, a place called Cape Trafalgar, and the English Navy under Horatio Nelson, they're going to meet these guys in the largest battle of this sort of age of, what we call age of sail, when these giant sort of wooden sailboats are going to attack each other. And so, very long story short, the Battle of Trafalgar is a resounding success. Huge amount of the French Navy is going to wind up on the bottom of the ocean, along with the Spanish Navy. And so what you've got here at the end of 1805 is these two huge military powers. They can't get at each other, though, because you've got Napoleon, and the analogy that one of the textbooks I used at one point said that it was like the tiger and the shark. Both are masters of their domain, but they can't really get at each other, of course, because if the tiger, sort of jumps in the water, the shark will tear him apart, and if the shark tries to hop up on land, he'll be at the tiger's complete and total mercy. So what both of these powers, as this war continues to escalate between England and France, what both of these powers decide to do is the war is going to have to take on an economic component, because they're going to have to find some way other than direct combat in order to defeat the other one. And so this economic war especially is going to turn towards America, that we need the Americans to sell us supplies and not our enemies. Up until this point, the United States has basically said, well, we're neutral. We're going to sell to whomever pays us the most money. So both Britain and France, after this takes place, say that, or they issue decrees that they will attack ships that trade with their enemies' ports. So basically here you got an American ship. We're neutral. We're neutral in your war, but we want to go sell some stuff to Liverpool, England. Well, French ships can then come in, and if we're heading towards England, they can attack us. Okay. And of course, if we're going to sell some stuff to Le Havre in France, English ships can swoop down on us, take our cargo, and they can attack us. So this is a way that really both Britain and France are trying to force America's hand. You need to pick a side. You need to pick which side you're going to be on. And of course, the United States, we don't want to be on any side, because that means that whatever side we're on, that means we're off with the other people. We're going to be at war with them. All right. Compounding this problem is the British and their Navy are often sort of forcing Americans to get involved in this, and that is through their policy of impressment. Now, for those of you who don't understand sort of what that means, all right, the British Navy at this point has what we would call a draft, right, where they're fighting a war with France. It's an overseas war with these guys. They need these guys to be in their Navy, all right, and so they're going to go and they're going to draft people, all right, and they never are able to really get enough. They're really never able to get enough people for their Navy. They have almost a sort of an insatiable need for sailing men. And so what they're going to do is when they find British ships on the high seas, they would basically raid the crew. They would say, okay, you know, I need like 10 guys from your crew. They're being drafted off, instead of off of England's shores to my ship, they're going to be drafted off of your ship. They're British citizens and onto my ship. Well, Americans, we don't care about that, right? What British people do to other British people, none of our business, okay? Now, of course, in the policy of trying to police the trade that's going between the United States and, say, France, or the United States and anywhere else, they would stop these American ships. Okay, where are you going? You know, show me your papers, blah, 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 blah. Do you have any English citizens aboard? Because if they have any English citizens working on the crew, well, they can get drafted. Again, it is an American ship, but, you know, for the most part, you draft an English citizen, not a lot we're going to do about it, right? They're your people. You draft them as you see fit, I guess, right? But you have some of these guys that are American citizens that are being drafted. And the British aren't terribly careful about who they grab. And of course, you have a difference of opinion in terms of what is it to be a citizen, all right? You'll have a lot of these English guys who are going to come over to the United States and they're going to say, okay, I've immigrated. I've immigrated to the United States. I'm now an American citizen. I meet the immigration status. I'm now citizenship in the United States. And so therefore, British guys, you can no longer draft me. And then you'll have some other guys who are probably a little less legal about the whole thing. They come over to a place like Philadelphia or Boston or something like that. They pay a few dollars to some guy. He makes up some fake papers, says, okay, you're now a citizen of the United States. So how do you tell the difference between an American? Some of these guys, of course, have English-sounding accents. Some of these guys in the Mid-Atlantic, you know, Philadelphia, New Jersey, and things like that. They have this accent that sort of sounds British. He says, no, I'm American. You know, you sound English. Well, you really shouldn't draft that guy. And then you got a guy who's, no, I've lived in America for 10 years now, I'm an American citizen. Well, the policy of the British at that point was, no, you were born a British citizen, and that makes you a British citizen forever. Well, that's sort of a legal, kind of thing. And then, of course, you got these guys that really are British citizens, and they've got maybe fake paperwork, or maybe they don't have any paperwork, but they're straight up lying. No, I'm an American now. Well, a bunch of Americans, or at least people that the United States government regard as Americans, are going to be pulled off of American ships, and they're going to be forced to fight in the British Navy. This is no small thing. Between 1808 and 1811, we think about 6,000 Americans are drafted into somebody else's military. So you've got some economic problems, you've got some trade problems, you've also got some citizenship issues now between the United States and these European powers that are causing some significant problems. This is going to lead us directly to the Embargo Act of 1807, right? Jefferson looks at this situation and says, man, we really need to stand up for ourselves, right? And of course he turns probably to the Secretary of War and says, okay, how prepared are we to fight? We're not. And of course a large measure of that, by the time that 1807 is one of Jefferson's last years in office, hey, you remember how you cut the military to the bone? Yeah, we can't do anything to these people. The United States Navy especially, which would be the most useful in a potential engagement at this point, has been not kept up very well. So Jefferson realizes that the United States is too weak to fight. I don't know that he would say out loud, and it's all my fault, but it totally is. So basically he asks Congress to do something else. They're going to engage in an economic war. They're going to try to engage us economically. Well, we'll engage them economically. And he asks Congress to pass an embargo on both France and England, where basically, all right, the United States, we're not going to trade with either one of you. You guys pick positions, political positions that we don't like. Pox on both your houses. Screw you. We're not going to trade with either one of you. That might sound like a nifty little political middle finger to extend to anybody, but you got to stop and figure, what exactly effect is this going to have on the United States at this point? Because if you are in the United States and you're engaged in any kind of overseas trade, and basically everybody at this point is directly or indirectly, huge percentage of the population is tied to overseas trade. What are the two biggest trading partners the United States has in overseas trade? France and England. So, no, we're not going to trade with either one of those guys. Okay. Basically, the only major effect that this has is to slow the United States economy down. neither France nor England sort of fall off their chairs and go, oh, we're not going to get American goods anymore. Oh no, what are we going to do? This has no significant effect politically, economically on these guys. And in fact, what you're going to see here is the main political effect that it has is that many people hate the embargo. They absolutely hate it. And in fact, it is repealed almost as soon as Jefferson gets out of office in 1809. It significantly fractures the relationship of the states to the federal government. New England and New York, which were the major trading partners, especially with England, they had open talks of seceding from the Union. So that way they could strike their own trade deals. And they're like, look, we fought the British, we got our independence, there's no reason for us to be nasty to them. We make tons of money off of trading with England. This embargo sucks. It is awful. We need to get rid of it right now. Hey, if we had our own country, we could do that. And so this was a major problem, basically all around the board. All right. Just so that we can say that we tried to find the silver lining on this sort of cloud. It did a good job of killing trade, but what it did do is it forced a lot of people who had some capital to invest and say, okay, well, we can't invest in overseas trade. What can we invest in? Well, a lot of the goods that were coming in from England and or France were manufactured goods. So naturally, those aren't going to come in anymore. So how are we going to get manufactured goods to American consumers? We may have to make them ourselves. So what you're going to see is, especially in New England, a lot of these people are going to invest in domestic industry. All right. During this period, you will see many new factories are going to open, and that is part of the reason why New England is going to become the nucleus of the very early sort of American industrial movement, with some early attempts at mechanization and things like that, eventually leading to, by the late 1800s, which you can catch up on if you take the first part of American History 2 with me, in the Industrial Revolution. So this is sort of the early sort of granule of some of it. Would it have happened had the Embargo Act not taken place? Possibly. We don't know for sure. But this is one of the sort of small areas, small effects that does take place and eventually would get big and very important. This is a political sort of cartoon lampooning the Embargo Act of 1807. And so here you can see that the embargo is often put into these terms as it was a turtle. Because when the turtle is attacked or offended or something like that, it's not like the lion that sort of attacks back with fangs and claws, or even the elephant that sort of stomps with its feet. The turtle sort of hides in its shell. It gets scared and it hides behind its shell of impenetrable scales, so that way you can't get at it anymore. And basically that was the idea, was that the United States was not fighting for its interests, it was just hiding. It was hiding economically, and you can see in the background all these ships are sort of tied up at the port. Their masts and their crossbars are all akimbo. They're not going to be going anywhere anytime soon. They're not laden with goods, which is why you see they're kind of leaning over, because they're pretty top heavy. So this was the idea that economically trade had been kind of killed. The Americans, were not being very brave. We're just sort of hiding in our shells. So this is the end here of this section.